All right, imagine this. You wake up in a concrete box, no windows, no human contact. The only sounds you hear are your own breathing and the occasional echo of a guard's footsteps down the hall. You have no idea what time it is, no idea what day it is. The walls feel like they're closing in, and the silence is so loud it starts to play tricks on your mind. This, my good people, is solitary confinement. Now, for some, it lasts days, for others, months, or even years. And for too many, the damage is irreversible. You have anxiety, depression, hallucinations, rage, hopelessness. The system calls it punishment, but what it really does is break people down, strip them of their sanity, and release them back into the world more broken than before. So today, on the Conviction Fiction, we're exposing the brutal reality of solitary confinement. We'll break down the psychological effects, hear some stories of those who've endured it, and explore the alternatives. Because locking people away in a box isn't justice, it's torture. And it's time we talk about it. Welcome to the Conviction Fiction, guys. I am, again, your host. My name is Antoine Rivers, and today we're going to talk about solitary confinement. I spent some time in the hole. Um, I tried to read books. I wasn't in there long, but I knew some people that was in there long. So what we're going to do is break down solitary confinement. So what is solitary confinement? Now, basically, it's a form of incarceration where an individual is placed in a small enclosed cell for a minimum of 23 hours a day. All right. There's no human contact. They mostly use it as a disciplinary measure for, I don't know, protective custody sometimes, or for individuals deemed as a security risk. You know, if you want to go psycho and say, like, I'm going to kill everybody, and then they're going to put them in the hole. If, get into an altercation or you are deemed the cause of, say, like a riot situation or something like that, then you're going in the hole. But it's more about security. They say you're a security risk to yourself or to others. So we're going to put you in this hole for 23 hours. Now, the characteristics of solitary confinement, what normally happens is there's some like extreme isolation. You're confined alone. You don't have no interaction with other inmates. I mean, you might throw a kite up under the door or some shit like that. You might see a guard come through every now and then, but there's no interaction with no one. Okay. Um, Most times they don't have cells with windows in them. It's basically a hole. It's dark. There's no natural light, fresh air. Hopefully, if it's summer time, hopefully the air conditioning's working. Most times it's not, so you're basically in the sweat box. And then the winter, the heat don't work either, so you're in a freezer. Now, many prisoners report that they lose their sense of time due to the lack of external stimulation. I mean, you don't know what day it is. I remember when I was locked up like that, I made a little calendar with numbers. I drew like I guess like a spreadsheet, or put grids, made a calendar, like drew lines on a piece of paper, put the date, made a calendar, like, because I need to know what time it was, and I would mark down the days when they said I was going to get out. Of course, you got to go through a hearing and all this stuff to see if you can be let out. Now, when you're in solitary confinement, you're denied access to like other people. You can't do activities with other people. You can't go eat chow, or what I'm saying, go to work, or if you were in school, like a program or rehab or something like that, or one of those recovery programs. And often you don't even get phone calls or visitation rights. And that minimal human contact, it typically just revolves around guards delivering food to you or just, looking to see if you're still alive. I mean, what conversations would you have? If they are allowed, you talking through a door, or you just yelling it to the top of your lungs to someone else that may be next door to you or down the hall. You know, um, most of them are like 6 by 8. They very small. Um, I know the one that I have been in, or ones that I've been in, they were extremely small, like 6 foot by 8 foot. About the size of like your typical parking space. Like if you were to go to your Walmart or something, like a parking space, it's just that you got a bed in there, a toilet, and a sink. That's it. Now most times, that's when you can get your workout on. You can sit there and do like a ton of push-ups. So ain't nobody gonna stop you. And then you go drink the water out the sink. Now, while some prison officials and some people in the criminal justice system, they argue that it's necessary for solitary confinement to be in the system. You got to manage dangerous inmates. That's what they say. We need this to manage dangerous inmates. But research has shown that prolonged isolation really increases self-harm. It increases suicide rates, and it hinders successful reintegration into society. Many experts and human rights organizations, including the United Nations, have called for limitations or just bans on it, solitary confinement, especially for juveniles, because, you're talking about someone under the age of 16. We've had some people on the show that were locked up while they were juveniles. And, with solitary confinement, United Nations and these other organizations have deemed it or try to get bans for solitary confinement for juveniles and individuals with mental illnesses. But does that work? I don't think it works. I really don't. Personally, I know that, being locked up and then being thrown in there like that, I mean, you're doubly locked up. First of all, you're locked up from society. You can't be around your family, your friends. You can't like make meaningful income. You're basically a ward of the state or the ward of the feds. Okay. Um, and then you're going to get locked up again within your lockup. It's a double confinement. Now, Solitary Watch is a nonprofit watchdog organization that investigates, documents, and tries to figure out why the widespread use of solitary confinement in U.S. prisons and jails is so prevalent. And they aim to raise like the public awareness, talk about it, and promote policy change. And their mission is to provide the public, legal professionals, law enforcement, and people within the prison and their families with a reputable source of information about solitary confinement and other harsh prison conditions. Now, solitary just lock up, right? The whole it remains a significant aspect of the U.S. penal system, whether in the feds or in state penitentiaries. Now, there are some notable implications for the incarcerated population. First, let's talk about the numbers. Right? When I was reading this, I was like, how in the hell they lock up all that many people? Excuse me, and then put them in a hole. Right? I was reading this. It was a study that says in 2019 there were about 81,000 individuals, or about 6.3% of the total U.S. prison population. So I guess it ain't that much, right? 81,000 individuals only representing 6.3%. That's pretty small. But those 81,000 people were held in solitary confinement in state or federal prisons on any given day. There's someone in the hole right now. If you're listening to this podcast, someone's sitting in the hole with no light, with no conversation, probably been in there all day for um, days, months, weeks, years. And in local and federal jails, about 42,000 individuals were subjected to solitary confinement during this same period. Now, you can't tell me there's no mental impact to this. Research indicates that individuals in solitary confinement exhibit disproportionately high rates of serious mental illness and self harming behaviors compared to the general prison population. And why is that? Because they are locked up, taken away from everything, bro. They're taken away and we have people that are put in holes right now, you know, because we don't have some method of dealing with whatever problem they dealing with. We don't know how to handle them. You know, we treat them like mental patients. Now, notably, while comprising only 6 to 8% of the total prison population, individuals in solitary confinement still account for 50% of all suicides within prisons. And we're going to talk about some of those suicidal cases as we go through the podcast today. Now, what's even more disturbing is that a study, this study focused on like Pennsylvania. You know, I try to be around the board. Shout out to my friends up in Pennsylvania. I want to give a special shout out to the Dream Builders Foundation, Ebony Rostover and her crew, as they work for criminal justice reform in the Pennsylvania area. Now, in Pennsylvania, there was a study that revealed that 11% of black men born between 1986 and 1989 had experienced solitary confinement by the age of 32. So, black men between the ages of, or born within 1986, which like 38 to damn near, it's 37, 38, 37, 36. They had experienced some type of solitary confinement before they were 32. And compared to other races, it was a significant disparity in the application of this practice. Now, we're not going to get into that because we can talk about race. And I mean, I guess on this podcast, on the Convicted Fix, we need to talk about race. I mean, everybody get locked up, but disproportionately, there are people of color that are locked up at a more alarming rate than any other group. Now, after reading this study from this Pennsylvania case, I said to myself, okay, not only are we being locked up at a disproportionate rate because I am a person of color, but we're locked up at a disproportionate rate. But more so than that, we are placed in solitary confinement more than any other race. Now, these statistics underscore the extensive use of solitary confinement, especially in the United States, and its profound impact on mental health, as well as the evident racial disparities associated with its implementation. So let's talk about like why it started in the first place, right? So the original intent was a path to reflect and rehabilitate, right? That was the original intent for solitary confinement. The reason for the hold was so you can go sit down for 23 hours a day, for however long you were, sentenced to this thing, because most time it's like the warden. It's not your peers anymore. You're dealing with the warden or the lead of whatever prison you in, and they put you in there, and they have like a little board, and they're like, "Are we gonna give them 21 days, or we're gonna give them 3 months or 6 months?" But it's an interesting story that we're gonna find out later on this podcast. But in the beginning, the original intent for solitary confinement was to reflect and rehabilitate, right? So they say you just needed a big boy timeout, right? Now, this was introduced early in the 19th century, right, as a way to encourage um, that time out. Go ahead and reflect and think about your life. The idea was that isolating prisoners from distractions and negative influences would give them time to think about their crimes. Think about like what you did to get up in the hole, to repent, and ultimately, change yourself. Go ahead and reform yourself. Now, the first use of solitary confinement in the U.S., from my research, was at Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania in the 1820s. Now, this was a long time ago, right? Um, and it was probably white people. It was probably people of, they didn't have color like that because in the 1820s in Pennsylvania, let's just be honest. I mean, if you were convicted of a crime while black in 1820, you probably just, get murdered right there in the street. You probably get hanged or quartered, right? Which was an interesting thing. Quartered. That was something where they would, like, tie you up to horses, and it would be like one arm on a one horse, another arm on another horse, your leg on another horse, and they like, yeah, and then the horses just put you in quarters. So, but solitary confinement, they were trying to like reform and have people reflect back in the 1820s in Pennsylvania, and it was part of the Pennsylvania system. That's a term, guys. The Pennsylvania system. Look it up, which aimed to rehabilitate prisoners through enforced silence and isolation. Now, most reformers believe that solitude would lead to some type of moral improvement, much like going to a mosque or going to like a monastery or something like that, where you could basically just pray and develop a sense of remorse. Right? We gonna let God deal with you. Right? That's basically what they were saying. They was like, we're gonna let God deal with you. Now, this approach was considered more humane than like physical punishment, which a lot of people of color had to deal with. Whippings and um, quartering or hanging. All that physical punishment for black people was really happening at the time. But this was considered solitary confinement was considered more humane because like at least think about what you did. Like think about your life. You could be quartered. You could be hung. You could be whipped. So you could be tarred and feathered. So think about your life while you up here doing this crazy stuff. Now, the early studies revealed that there was some severe psychological distress among inmates that were subjected to this solitary confinement. Because by the late 19th century, many prisons abandoned the practice altogether because of the harm that it caused. Um, Now it came back in the 20th and 21st century as a tool of controlling punishment. But the reality, guys, is that punishment, control, and overuse, it's no longer about rehabilitation. It's primarily used as a disciplinary measure, a tool for managing prison populations, and in some cases, a form of retribution. Solitary confinement is frequently used as punishment for minor infractions. I mean, you can go to the hole for talking back to a guard. You can go to the hole for having contraband. This is something that is common. I mean, rather than a last resort for violent behavior, it can be used as a way to just not have to deal with you. If guards don't want to deal with you, send them to the hole. Right? Now, while it was originally meant to be temporary, some prisoners remain in isolation for months, years, or even decades. In extreme cases, individuals have spent over 40 years in solitary. We're going to talk about the Angola 3. All right, we're going to talk about that in this podcast. So, why do prison staff use solitary confinement as a means to control difficult prisoners instead of actually rehabilitating them or somehow putting them in a mode of recovery, setting them up for success? Right? Why is it that they use it to suppress activism within prisons? or to retaliate against those who file complaints about conditions. Right? You got prisoners that complain about how there's no running water, or they're bug infested, and you can talk about how the overcrowding issue. Okay, if you speak out on those things, then you could be put in a hole, right? But the original intent, guys, was to rehabilitate, so they say. So now, for me, I think the solitary confinement, this it 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 just doesn't fit the bill for a lot of the juveniles or individuals with mental illnesses, and the minorities, especially people of color. Many of these individuals are more likely to deteriorate mentally due to the prolonged isolation. We're talking about juveniles, right? Young kids that haven't even developed who they are destined to be, and you're like isolating them. Because in my heart, they shouldn't be there in the first place. A lot of the individuals that are, under the age of not even legally adults are in penitentiaries right now. But to isolate them even further, I don't see how that could actually benefit them in the long run. In the long run, I don't see how that would benefit them. Instead of fostering reflection, solitary confinement has been shown to increase violent behavior. Believe it or not, it actually worsens mental health conditions and makes reentry into society more difficult. The modern reality of solitary confinement starkly contrasts with its original purpose. Instead of trying to reform individuals, it's actually breaking them down. It's leading them to long-term trauma, increased recidivism. Yeah, pretty much. Solitary confinement, you're not around people, but you're going to let them out around people. Okay? You can't lock up a prisoner for so long, months, even years in some cases, and then let them back out in society and expect them to deal successfully with people. There's a growing momentum, and I'm a part of that momentum. I'm a part of that growth to reform or abolish this practice. We don't need solitary confinement. With mental health experts and human rights on my side and other organizations, it is a form of torture, guys, rather than a tool of justice. Now, yeah, we know about the shoe, right? The shoe syndrome. If not, I'm gonna tell you this: what this podcast is about educating you. The shoe syndrome. It's going to. We were talking about the psychiatric effects of prolonged solitary confinement when you're in those special housing units, those shoes. That's what we call them. Going to the shoe, right? Now, these administrative prisons, these segregations, right? These things will bring out prisoners. Within prisoners, it brings individuals to have cognitive difficulties. They have problems with thinking, concentration, and memory. You've been in a hole, you don't even know what day it is, right? You don't know, you haven't talked to your family, you're worried about your family or friends, or maybe you're not even worried about your family or friends, maybe you're not, right? But you're put in this hole to deal with life by yourself when you're not equipped to deal with life. I mean, you probably grew up, a lot of people didn't grow up with like families or stuff like that. And because of your behaviors and your acting out, now they're putting you in this hole. Now you sitting in this hole like, well, why did I deserve this? Right. And this extreme anxiety, this panic, and other mood swings can start producing hallucinations. You can start thinking about, just being delusional. You're increasing the risk of suicide and self-harm when you put in this situation. right? Because there's social withdrawal, and then there's isolation, and then with the lack of human contact, nobody even there to come talk to you, and the stressful environment of this solitary confinement, it contributes to the development of the SHU syndrome. That's what it's called, the SHU syndrome, Special Housing Unit Syndrome. Now, don't believe me for it. The researchers have studied this, and they said that the psychological effects of solitary confinement have shown that it can lead to permanent or semi-permanent changes in brain psychology. You are rewired. Your whole brain is rewired because of that, right? And then so the legal experts started to come into it, and because of one or two, here's the thing: when it comes to people that are in solitary confinement, the rate of suicide amongst prisoners is increased because of solitary confinement, then that's cause to abolish this whole practice. Now, legally, the use of solitary confinement has come into scrutiny, man. It's, people have been challenging this for years. Some arguing that it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Because when you think about the mental health aspects, it worsens because individuals, especially those with pre-existing mental health conditions or juveniles, it can lead them to decompensate and require more care or some type of psychiatric hospitalization because they already have problems, and then you put them in a situation where they're having to deal with it by themselves, and then they might be on meds. You never know. Now, when we talk about decompensation, this is used to describe the inability of a person with a mental illness to maintain normal or appropriate psychological defenses when faced with stress. So you're talking about a person with a mental illness. They are placed in the hole and they don't know how to deal with the stress. Right? They don't have the appropriate psychological defenses when dealing with the stress. Right? They've already been pretty much like told, it's been documented that this person has a mental illness, whether it's schizophrenia or any ADHD or, autism, that you're going to throw them in a hole because you don't want to deal with them. Let's be honest, most of the folks that are, and I'm not knocking people that have jobs because, prison systems have been around forever. But most of those guys, man, they just got a job. You can go, the requirement to be a guard is like a high school diploma. For real. You know what I'm saying? And you're dealing with somebody with a mental illness. And because you can't deal with them, you're not equipped to deal with this person, right? You throw them in the hole. And this prolonged solitary confinement has been documented. It's shown to cause severe and often irreversible psychological damage. One notable firsthand account is that of Alfred Woodfox. Now, this guy, he was part of the Angola 3. Albert Woodfox, look him up. He was locked up in solitary confinement for 40 years. 40 years. That's 23 hours a day, 365 days a year, 40 times. And he was locked up at the Louisiana State Penitentiary known as Angola. Right? We all heard about Angola. Woodfox described this experience as the most, basically, he said he could barely collect his thoughts. Today, he's out now, and he can barely collect his own thoughts. He was one of the first. He was considered what they call the Angola 3. And he actually holds the record for someone that was the person that was in isolation longer than any other American. He came home to face his future, and this was reported from the New Yorker. It was published back in January Let me see. What was this article published? January 2017. He and two other black nationalists were in solitary confinement for a total of more than 100 years collectively. They became known as the Angola Three. Now, I'm going to put a link to this story in our social media sites because I didn't make this up. This man was locked up in solitary confinement for 40 years. Him and his other two partners collectively had a total of over 100 years of solitary confinement. Over 100 years. Now, we know how solitary confinement inflicts profound and lasting harm on vulnerable populations like juveniles, people with pre-existing mental illnesses, incarcerated women, and marginalized communities. But these folks were locked up for this guy, Alfred Woodfox, was locked up for more than 40 years. And you got to read that story because he was locked up he was a part of the Black Panther movement. And, I guess we could talk about how incarceration has been used to stop movements at some point, um, either here or there. But, we're not going to be too radical. But he was locked up for 40 years. In segregation, in the shoe. Now, isolating young individuals. Let's talk about the young people, like how it disrupts their psychological development, how it leads to severe mental health issues. The studies have shown that solitary confinement can cause extreme anguish and provoke severe mental and physical health problems in juveniles. Now, this isolation promotes stress, and most times it leads to some type of self harm or suicidal ideas. People with existing mental health illnesses, we kind of touched on that before. But it cannot be overstated that individuals in solitary confinement are more likely to develop. Research indicates that individuals in solitary confinement do develop psychiatric disorders more so than those in the general population. Now, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Especially when we talk about women. What about the women? Because we have incarcerated women. Shout out to those women that have made it through the struggle. Those that are still in the struggle. I want to give a special shout out to April Park of AP Rose. She has an event coming up later this month in Second Chance Month, which is the month of April. We're in. She has a reality show called The Queenables. Want to give a special shout out to April. Big ups and much respect to your. Right? But the women facing solitary confinement, they face unique challenges, including higher rates of pre-existing mental health issues and vulnerability to abuse. Now, reports have highlighted that cases where female inmates were subjected to prolonged isolation, they've been thrown in the shoe, it often leads to severe psychological distress and in some instances tragic outcomes. Now, we already talked about how it disproportionately affects people of color. Racial minorities and individuals with disabilities, Black and Latino individuals, we know placed in solitary rates far higher than their white counterparts. Or I do want to talk about some examples. All right, so Layleen Polanco. I don't know if you guys ever heard of that. Look it up. Layleen Polanco. This was a transgender woman who died in solitary confinement at Rikers Island, despite the known medical conditions of this person, and it highlights the system negligence. We're also going to talk about Malcolm Morton, who is an indigenous Australian man with intellectual disabilities and epilepsy, who spent years in solitary confinement, leading to significant and more physical issues for him. Now, let's talk about the first one. On May 14th, back in the day, 20 days, 20 years ago, Laylene Polanco, was sentenced to 20 days in solitary confinement for a physical altercation with another individual in custody at the transgender housing unit dormitory. I didn't even know they had that. Not. I try to keep my ear to the streets, so to speak, as far as what's going on. But at Rikers Island, they had they have a transgender housing unit. And on May 14th, one day later, Laylene exhibited intense feelings of psychological distress, including thoughts of suicide, hallucinations, and panic attacks. Now, the notes of a report from an officer said that Laylene was randomly crying and shouting, and that while in the distressed state, Laylene Polanco reportedly assaulted an officer on the arm with her fist out, and she was sent for a 9-day stay to a hospital for psychosis and mania. Now, 8 of those days were spent in a psychiatric prison ward. Now, just a week later, Laylene returned to Rikers. They took this person back to Rikers, and correctional staff debated where to place Laylene. They didn't know where to put her. She already had talked about mania and thoughts of suicide. So the department's tour commander wrote that a psychiatrist could not authorize solitary confinement for Laylene because she had a seizure disorder. But they placed in solitary confinement anyway. And on May 30th, after clearance from a correctional health services medical doctor, the board found that the jail's housing policies do not place trans women with other women increase pressure to isolate Polanco. So they didn't consider placing Laylene Polanco in a men's facility. It's one of those things like, boys' bathroom, women's bathroom. Where do you go? I mean, you're transgender. So although the officers knew of the epilepsy and, the seizures that Laylene Polanco had, she was ultimately cleared for solitary confinement, where she spent the next 17 hours a day in a cell. And a doctor came in and said that her condition is stable. They checked on her every day. But on the day of her death, she was left alone for periods of an hour and a half. Even though the policy of the DOC stipulates that inmates placed in solitary confinement should be observed every 15 minutes, they didn't look after this person for hours. As a result, Polanco died. It was an epileptic. She had an epileptic seizure. Because most epileptic people, when they have a seizure, they are at greater risk of injury or death and unable to help themselves. They can fall, suffer trauma, stop breathing, just among other things. And that's exactly how Laylene died. Now, this is not a case of a mistake or a medical problem that slipped through the cracks. This was a thought out decision to put a person in a situation where the risk of injury and death were obvious and known. This seizure was Laylene's third while she was in custody. This is the third seizure that this person had, and they threw her in solitary confinement and did not check on her. All right. So that's just one case. But let's talk about Malcolm Morton. Now, this Australian indigenous man, you should really check out his art. I was looking at his story where Malcolm, he actually killed his uncle in a fit of rage. I think his uncle was beating on him, or some form of abuse, and he got fed up and like murdered him. But he does have definitely a mental illness. Um, he had been tied to a restraint chair multiple times, sometimes for up to 3 hours, and they frequently sedated Malcolm. Now, this person was subjected to the most severe treatment in prison because, most, like I said, most guards or staff, they don't know how to deal with people with mental illnesses and stuff like that. They just say, throw them in the hole, right? And you never know, like that person that you're throwing in the hole may be in need of more sustained care. Okay. Um, Now, Malcolm, it was a commission that came through and they said that it was cruel, inhuman, and degrading for him. Going back, he did fatally stab his uncle because of some type of abuse. And he was said that he could not, um, he was found unfit to plead in his case. So they just locked him up, right? They locked him up. Um, and the story, he's still he's still around and stuff like that, but they've been trying to a lot of the um criminal justice reform organizations around, especially since he's Australian, he's from another country. Over here he's locked up, and a lot of people wanted to see Malcolm out because he has some breathtaking art that I've seen. um Now, despite the criticism, solitary confinement and its severe psychological and social consequences, many systems and human rights organizations have started to advocate for alternative disciplinary and rehabilitative methods that focus on mental health, focus on safety, and they focus on rehabilitation or habilitation. As we know, if you've been listening to the show, you can't be rehabilitated if you never knew how to live. They have been advocating for like special mental health units. So instead of isolation for those people with mental health conditions, let's put them in designated mental health units staffed with trained professionals. How about that? Is that such a far fetched idea? I don't think so. Um, Now this would actually help, like the underlying mental health issues, rather than exacerbating them, reducing self harm, violence, and recidivism. Other people ask for restorative justice programs. Now, these programs would focus on accountability, mediation, and reconciliation between the incarcerated individual, the victims, and the community. Does that sound too far fetched to like put people in programs where they can actually work with the victims, the community, and I don't know. Don't sound too far fetched for me because it can encourage personal growth, responsibility, and reintegration, leading to low rates of recidivism. Then you got also have step down programs. I think a lot of the people that have been on the show are part of step down programs. What it is basically a structured transition for individuals coming out of solitary by gradually reintegrating them into the general prison population with increased privileges and social interaction, which could help reduce psychological damage and help those individuals adjust to communal living before release. Learn how to live with people again. The last one, about giving access to some programs. Like, let's expand access to education. Let's expand access to therapy. Let's expand access to substance abuse treatment programs rather than resorting to isolation. This can help address the root cause of problematic behavior and prepare individuals for a successful reintegration into society. What's wrong with that? How about, I mean, let's go old school. What about just plain old conflict resolution? Just how to deal with conflict. When things don't go your way, can we just figure out how to deal with them without going ham on some shit? Why we can't just do that? Why? Why we can't just give some old plain conflict resolution where we can give correctional officers with nonviolent crisis intervention and conflict resolution techniques so they don't quick to want to throw you in the hole. All right? Because at the end of the day, guys, what I'm talking about is when it comes to coming home, right? Most of the people that are locked up will be returning home. And so if they are having to deal with solitary confinement and the mental toll that it places on them, that doesn't help them when they're out here. They can't run to a hole, right? We need to have them to deal with whatever issues that they've been dealing with and be able to succeed out here instead of being a part of recidivism, right? To believe that fear of punishment will prevent people from using, or if you think that locking them up is going to solve some things, the research doesn't support that. It doesn't support it. And there's a growing recognition that there needs to be a balanced approach to this, one that combines both public health, criminal justice, right? We have to think about this, guys, when it comes to doing this. Like, okay, for instance, right? There are some examples. So people are petitioning to stop this type of behavior, right? As far as solitary confinement, because banning solitary confinement for juveniles, especially for juveniles, and those individuals that have pre-existing mental health conditions. If you've been told that you got a mental health condition, there's no way you should be going into solitary confinement. If you're less than, if you 16, 17, you're a young guy and you up in prison, you don't need to be going to solitary confinement. You don't need that. All right. So there's some, you can petition your state, your level, your federal legislation. You can get on these petitions to basically limit the length of solitary confinement. Let's start there. Just don't put them in there too long. Like we were talking about the story with Angola 3, you have 100 years of incarceration in a solitary environment. And you let this person out. What makes you think that he's going to be successful? Or that it's not going to be difficult for him? You can advocate for policy change. You can engage with your lawmakers, your public officials, by writing letters or attending town hall meetings. Voice your concern about the use of solitary confinement for your family members, your friends, people that are going through this. You can help bring this issue to the forefront of policy discussions. Share those personal stories or research findings that you've found that emphasizes the psychological damage caused by solitary confinement. I knew one dude, man. He had been locked. And he had mental health issues. I was locked up with him. He had mental health issues or whatnot, and he was always in the hole. I'm like, well, why y'all keep letting him out? Shouldn't he be somewhere else? He not only present a danger to himself, but to other inmates, right? Right. So if he out, then out of fear. I'm just saying, for example, I never did that to him, but I'm just saying this is how I go. You let somebody out that's crazy. He come to you. You know he crazy, right? And then what do you do? What do you do? I'm gonna get him before he get me. I'm gonna get him. So you put in my freedom. If I'm trying to get out of prison, what you let him out, he run around in on the yard or whatever. He having a bad day or some shit like that. Then he run into me. I ain't got time for it because I'm thinking he's trying to hurt me or some shit. Then I hurt him. Then you're gonna lock me up. But you knew he had mental health issues. You knew what was going on. You put him in solitary confinement. It's only making shit worse. Why not have programs that emphasize giving this person the psychological help that they need, like the psychological coaching or you know medications. I don't know, but it puts everybody in danger at risk, right? So we need to raise the public awareness. Use social media to spread the awareness about the harms of solitary confinement. Share the facts, news stories, tell them stories that you know about, and resources from reputable organizations. You could, share a podcast episode like this one on solitary confinement. Use hashtags like in solitary, hashtag in solitary, or hashtag prison reform to join the conversation. Um, some organizations offer opportunities to volunteer time and skills. If you are skilled where you can assist with the outreach, fundraise some events, or provide support to individuals impacted by the criminal justice system, you can do that. This is a call to action, guys. I want you to encourage and support programs that prioritize habilitations over in punishment. Restorative justice practices and mental health programs in correctional facilities are a must. Please advocate for reforms within the prison system that focus on mental health care, trauma-informed care, and restorative justice programs. That's what we are talking about today. All right. Now, we've discussed that solitary confinement, being in a hole, being in lockup, going to the shoe is not just a correctional tool, it's a human rights issue. The lasting psychological toll it inflicts, especially on juveniles, individuals with mental illnesses, marginalized communities, women, all of that is something we can no longer ignore. This is a practice that leaves deep scars, affecting the mental well being and future of those subjected to it. So it's time to rethink the way we approach punishment, justice, and rehabilitation in this country, guys. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us on this critical conversation. We need to keep talking about this, raising awareness and pushing for change. Now, if this episode has resonated with you, don't hesitate to continue the discussion with others, whether online, with your community, with your husband, your girlfriend, your wife, your cousin that's locked up, whatever. Even with lawmakers, those people who can make a difference, just talk to someone. And if you haven't already, be sure to catch up on previous episodes of the Conviction Fiction, where we dive deep into the complexities of life after incarceration, the criminal justice systems, and stories of resilience and change. But before we go, I'm excited to announce that I'll be at the POD Car and Bike Show on April 19th, where I'll be signing copies of my book, The Conviction Fiction, Changing the Narrative of Life After Lockup. I really hope to see you guys there. And without any further ado, stay free, stay up, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and to catch up on all the episodes and be a part of the narrative change. See you later.